So let me tell you about our panel, starting on your far left, my far right. Tim Duggan, he's content director at Sound Alliance, who do sites like In the Mix, Faster Louder, Same Same, and Junkie. Now, Tim has worked in advertising as a writer for Rolling Stone magazine, and I noticed that his last tweet was a reminder that this session is being streamed live on Junkie. So hello, Junkie. Next to me here is Simon Creera. Now, he's editor of BuzzFeed Australia. Now, he describes, if you look him up on LinkedIn, his job is making stuff go viral on the internet. Now, Simon has also worked for News Corp and for Fairfax in Australia and for The Times and the Sunday Times in the UK. Now, currently sitting at the top of Simon's Twitter feed is the link 33 reasons the Outback is off the hook. Next to me on the other side, Mark Scott, also used to work at Fairfax, the managing director of the ABC for the last nearly 9 years now. Mark's been at the helm of the national broadcaster during the time that it's gone digital in just about every conceivable way. He's currently grappling with the reduction in government funding for the ABC, and Mark's also been known to tweet cat photos. Next to Mark is Peter Fray, deputy editor of The Australian. Now, before returning to newspapers, Peter last year tried his own journalism experiment with the launch of fact-checking site PolitiFact Australia. Before that, Peter spent many years with Fairfax, including editing the Sydney Morning Herald, also the Canberra Times and the Sunday Age. And he's also been known to retweet Mark Scott's cat photos.
Very kind.
My mistake.
Very kind.
It was a mistake.
Yeah.
Now, before we get to that question of whether cat videos can save journalism, we should probably establish that question of, does journalism actually need saving? So, Peter, I'm going to come to you this first one. What actually is happening to the people and the organisations who produce journalism at the moment? And where does your organisation sit in that?
Oh, okay. Well, take this in order. Look, I think we are living through the greatest expansion of human expression via digital means that, in our history, in the history of humanity. There are, in a sense, more journalisms out there now than ever before, hence this panel in a way. There are more people who fulfill the role of the various roles of the journalists than ever before. They may be being paid for it, they may be amateur for it, they may be corporations pretending to be journalists. There's all sorts of journalisms out there. There's all sorts of journalists out there, journalisms out there. And the other part of that is the audience is now bigger than ever before. So when we talk about, I don't believe we are the journalism in terms of people communicating, people seeking truth, people engaging with other people, people collaborating, and if you like, people putting up cat videos, is in trouble. I don't think it needs saving. I mean, ultimately, I think what we're talking about in this discussion is really the business model that funds it, and we'll get to that, I'm sure. But in terms of journalism, does journalism need saving? And cats aren't going to save anything, let's face it. But, oh, come on. But in all seriousness, we are living in this kind of golden age. And the other point I'd make is that I think we need to stop talking about digital as if it suddenly appeared 2 weeks ago and destroyed everything. We've been living in a digital age now for 20-odd years. I am not, I guess, a digital native, but I'm certainly not a digital denialist. And it seems to me that, and hopefully this conversation may go some of the way to changing the way we talk about this stuff, because we're talking about it, a lot of us in the journalism industry are talking about it as if it arrived last week, it came with a bloody big axe and cut all our heads off. That ain't happening. That's not happening.
Now, just before I come to Mark, you relatively recently joined News Corp.
I'm a very new boy.
How does it, as a new boy, how does it look for that organisation as a new set of eyes on it?
Oh, look, I think I've enjoyed the Oz, and the Oz does lots of really interesting things, but there's no other place that takes policy, public policy, and I'm sure there's a lot of people would have disagreement about how it does it, but it's a fact that the Australian is the one place that is deeply engaged with public policy and politics in this country. And that is a very positive thing to be, and I know you are too, Don.
Thanks.
Just wait. And I know those guys are as well in their own way. So, but that's why it goes back to my initial point, is that there is a lot of it out there. There are more audiences now. There are more people being journalists now than ever before. We should be happy.
Okay, well, let's come on to Mark. That central question, does journalism need saving?
Well, I think the critical question is how you fund it. I think there's no doubt there's this great exploration of ideas and debate. There are more forums, more outlets than ever before. The critical question is how you fund it. And I think that is just an unknown question at this point. And I agree with my old colleague Frey about, we're 20 years into this. But I suspect if you look at what happened in Europe after the invention of the printing press, it was a 100-year revolution. And I suspect that we'll look back on 2014 and think we were really just only at the beginning of working out what Moore's law, what digitisation, what personalised technology and personalised choices means to the media industry. And I think
For those unfamiliar with Moore's law.
Well, it's the doubling of processing power. So your computers are getting more powerful, your phones are getting more powerful, and your connectedness, the opportunities of that just continue to grow. The unknown question, I think, is that, when Peter Frey and I worked together at Fairfax, there were 500 journalists working across the Sydney Morning Herald and the Sun Herald. Now it's closer to 200. That's happened in big established newsrooms all around the world, and what has been stripped away has been depth and specialisation and investigative reporting teams. And what is really interesting now, if you look at the Australian stands out as a survivor of that kind of deep investment in print in newsrooms in a way that certainly wasn't atypical a decade or two ago. And as the business model has eroded the ability to make the deep investment in journalism, there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of discussion, but who is actually doing the hard work of investigation, who is doing the hard work of the specialist people who really know that subject area well, digging, and actually breaking news. And I have a theory, and it's just a hypothesis, that despite all the outlets that are swimming around journalism and news, the people who are really creating and setting a news agenda, who are breaking news every day, who are telling us new things rather than just commenting on it and analysing it, still comes down to a core of traditional newspapers and a handful of broadcasters. And most of those newspapers and broadcasters have far fewer people invested in breaking news and telling news now than they did. So, there's lots of news about, there are more voices, there's more discussion, there's more debate. But at its core, is there a greater investment in journalism as we've typically seen it? No, and that's driven by the business model question, and the business model question is central to all of this, I think.
We'll come to business models in a few minutes. Simon, we'll come to you now. You've worked with both of the biggest traditional publishers in Australia, in News Corp and Fairfax. You've made the move, to the new part of the world. What's your perspective? Firstly, this initial question. Journalism, is it in trouble? Does it need saving?
I don't think it is, and I totally agree with Peter that in actual fact we're living in this golden age of journalism. And I think the fact that when I first worked in Australia, which was 12 years ago, it was basically the ABC and two big publishers, and now it's fragmented into this incredible, really exciting environment for readers and for consumers. And that BuzzFeed are here, The Guardian are here and investing very heavily, Huffington Post are coming, The Mail are here, and then there's newcomers like Junkie and Pedestrian and a whole load of other digital sites, New Matilda, a whole load of people dedicated in one way or another to sort of breaking news. And I think that that's really exciting for the media environment in Australia. And I think that that's reflected in the UK and the US and in other markets around the world where the digital kind of revolution, if you like, is really invigorating how people are looking at the world. From our point of view, I'm sure we'll get to our business model, but we've come from a place where we're really interested in cat videos and viral content and stuff like that on the internet. But we're moving into a place where we are investing seriously in investigative journalism, where we are putting reporters and bureaus around the world looking at the serious issues of the day. So I think we're very much at the beginning of the emergence of how this will reshape traditional media. I think that's the very exciting thing, an interesting thing to see how the models will collapse. And we're all very interested in seeing how Fairfax are going to respond and how News Corp are going to respond and how they're certainly in a difficult place. But I know, having worked at News Corp, that they're responding with a lot of nimbleness in terms of trying to reshape their businesses. The question, I guess, is can they reshape them fast enough to kind of compete with newcomers like us?
So Tim, as a new publisher, I guess you're arguably a part of the problem for the Newses and the Fairfaxes and the kind of, the longer established organisations.
Yeah, I think that the concept of what a journalist is shifting, and it's shifting really fast. So in the past, like 10, 20 years ago, the concept of a journalist was someone who worked for the Big Four, Sydney Morning Herald, Age, AFR and The Australian. And there used to be about 2,000 journalists, say, 15 years ago. It's about 1,000 now, and there's talk that it might become kind of, say, 500. So 500 of those kind of hard-hitting news journalists. But the concept, though, is that new media, so BuzzFeed, so Junkie, so In the Mix, Fast, Louder, Same, Mess and Noise, all the kind of websites that we do. It's not journalism per se in that same kind of way, but it is a new way of communicating with the audience. And we're finding that is what our audience kind of wants to hear. I think the fact that the Australian media landscape at the moment, as Simon mentioned, BuzzFeed, BuzzFeed have launched very successfully. The Guardian have launched very successfully. Huffington Post are coming, Mashable's coming, TechCrunch is coming. And the problem is that no media are leaving. So there's 22 million eyeballs in Australia, and that space is just getting more and more and more crowded. And I think it's a great thing because competition is healthy, but it does mean that these new business models, which is ours, which is very lean. Simon has 6 to 8 staff. We've got about 30 across 5 titles. We are a super lean business model, and we are competing and sometimes winning against these big organisations that have thousands, hundreds of staff.
We've been bandying around this phrase business model, and I might stay with you, Tim. Really what we're talking about is how you get to pay the staff. At the end of the year, you've got to bring in more money than you spend. How do you do it?
So our business model, it's kind of built from the ground up as a digital business model. So each of our titles generally has about 2 full-time editorial staff. So Junkie is an example. So Junkie, a couple of months ago, won the title of the Media Brand of the Year, kind of beating out The Guardian, Pedestrian and Mamma Mia. And that's all done with 2 full-time editorial staff. So it's done extremely lean. And then we sell advertising on the site. And then the biggest area, which I think we kind of might kick on a little bit later, is native advertising. So native advertising, where we kind of create content for brands. That, for us, has grown from 0% to about 30% of our revenue in about 18 months.
And your definition of native advertising?
3-pronged definition: quality content, inspired by brand, and delivered in stream. So essentially, it's good stuff. It is, you can take a brand, you can kind of create amazing content for it, and it's delivered in stream, so it looks the same as every other piece of editorial. I'll just give an example of a really good piece of native, and this kind of can show how, in a way, it's starting to help us kind of save this kind of concept of journalism. We're about to publish next week a piece that's been brand funded by Kentucky. So Kentucky is a youth kind of travel brand, and it is a long-form piece. It's about 5,000 words, written by an amazing writer in Melbourne called Sam Cooney. And we, kind of a little bit like Into the Wild, we kind of took a story. The hook is 6 young Australians who moved to America. They got an old school bus and they kind of renovated it and they travelled across America. And we used that to kind of investigate why young people travel. The piece is called Why We Travel. It's an amazing piece of journalism, I suppose, and it's completely brand funded by Kentucky. And that, I suppose, is, there's an example of how our business model works.
Well, Simon, your business model is native advertising as well. Firstly, BuzzFeed, is it profitable?
Yeah, we're profitable, yes. Our revenue was, we turned over more than $100 million worth of sales last year.
This is globally, right?
Globally, that's right, yeah. And in Australia, we've had native campaigns running since we launched. We have no banner ads. We feel like the banner ad is dead, that nobody clicks on them, and I think the data really shows that. All our revenue comes from native advertising, and we work with brand partners. We work a little bit different, I think, to how Tim works, in that we have still a very clear definition between church and state. So our creative team and our sales team sit completely different part of the building and don't engage really with our writers at all. And so we work with, in Australia, we've been working with brands like McDonald's and Combank and a whole load of brands that are interested in targeting kind of a youth audience. And basically, we don't just say, here's a burger you want to buy. We have a campaign that has the ethos of the brand attached to it. Well, with McDonald's, we're doing a campaign on toppings, so you spend an extra 10 cents, you get an extra piece of toppings, and we did clever, quirky, fun, shareable lists about ways you can just bring a little bit of extra to your life, a little bit of VIP, like living to your life. And the idea is basically learning the lessons of how we create shareable content and how it moves socially through Facebook and Twitter, and actually pushing that content that way for the brand, so that it actually becomes something that they actually enjoy the piece of content and they want to share it on their own, so it's actually being distributed for nothing for the brand.
Well, Mark and Peter, before we move on from native, and I'll come to you first, Peter, how do you actually feel about native advertising as a traditional journalist?
I want to explore any way that makes dough to support journalism. I would love to see someone in this room put their hand up and say they're prepared to fund Kate McClymont's reporting on ICAC. And I would love to see a corporation in this country prepared to fund Kate McClymont reporting on ICAC. The point is that there ain't such a thing. And I think when we talk about journalism, we need to be clear what we're talking about. There are many types of journalism. If anyone in this room's ever done any journalism, 101 academic work, there are multiple ways and functions of journalism. But I think what I want to talk about for a second is that journalists exist to seek truth. I don't believe that, and I'm sure it's a wonderful piece, the Kon-Tiki tour of, man versus wild or whatever it is. I'm sure it's great, and I'm sure it's a very entertaining piece. And I have read some great stuff on Junkie, by the way, and I'm not slagging Junkie, and I'm not slagging BuzzFeed. I've read great stuff there. But if we take as our central premise, our central starting point, that journos exist to seek truth, and that journos need to work in collaboration with audiences, with people to seek truth, that's another thing that I think the digital world gives us, then we don't have a business model that sees us being supported by native advertising. As I say, I'm all for bringing dough in through the door. I'm not that precious about it. But I think we need to make a distinction that if we are seeking truth, then it's a very expensive thing to do, and not a lot of people want to fund it. And I can speak from my own experience in PolitiFact. The only way we made dough, well, we didn't really make dough out of PolitiFact. We'll
come to that in a minute. Let's nail down native advertising first.
My point is that I think we need to be clear what we're talking about. Journos exist to work on behalf of the public to seek truth. That's the fourth estate concept. Now, if that model, I'm happy to discuss that, because maybe that model's out of date,
Mark, are you comfortable with advertising?
I don't think it is, by the way.
With native advertising?
We have no plans to run native advertising on the ABC in the foreseeable future. I'm happy to make that very clear. Look, I think the fundamental thing, Tim, though, is that journalism, and particularly the kind of journalism that Peter's been talking about, has always been subsidised. It's always been subsidised. When we were at the Sydney Morning Herald together, it was subsidised by classifieds. You thought you were selling your car or trying to get a new employee, you were actually funding that newsroom of 500 people. And if it wasn't funded by that, it's been funded, you look at News Corporation, the Australian is being subsidised by other parts of the News Corporation empire. And so there's always been a subsidy that's needed to be found, and this is the latest way of... And I think there is an interesting question as to visibility for the audience. Do the audience know that that is paid content, directed content? But I think, there's often good branding and identification around that. But this is all a desperate pursuit to find new ways of maximising profit if you're in business, but also we are in pursuit of ways of how we're going to fund Kate McClymont, how we're going to fund that investment in traditional quality journalism as well.
And certainly, we basically, our number one video on BuzzFeed from a branded perspective is this Friskies Hello Kitty video, which has done 15 million views. The fact that that's been so successful for that brand, and it's very transparent, it's for that brand, that's the thing that allows us to invest in an investigative team of 6 reporters, and it allows us to invest in bureaus and sending reporters to Gaza and to the Ukraine and to trying to discover, tackle the most serious issues of the day.
Can I just ask, though, on that cross-subsidy thing, and if you looked at the old model of the Sydney Morning Herald, the readers bought the paper because of the journalism, but it was being cross-subsidised by the classifieds. But the thing that was driving the readers' attention was the journalism. What I don't understand about this model is that why really would you hire investigative journalists if, in fact, that's going to get a fraction of the traffic that the cat video is going to get? If, in fact, you're trying to maximise profit for your audience. Isn't that simply a waste of money? It wasn't a waste of money at the Herald because no one was going to buy the newspaper just for the classifieds. So that cross-subsidy was inextricably linked. I don't understand the link between foreign correspondents at BuzzFeed and cat videos?
I think it's scale. I think we're a private company, and it's very much Jonah's vision that we would be, take advantage of the fact and be responsible for the fact that we have this audience of 150 million people around the world, and a mainly very young, teenage, 20-something audience. And it's actually our responsibility to be serving that audience the serious issues of the day. And we've been discovering that, actual fact, young people really respond to those kind of things. Now, they're maybe not getting them from traditional newspapers, they may be not logging on to the BBC or the ABC, but they are on BuzzFeed. And so that's, I think, where it's come from. And I think that we're not interested in monetizing reporting from Gaza or Max Seddon in the Ukraine. But I think the fact is that the videos, the cat videos, and all the other branded content are powering it. And I think people don't come to BuzzFeed and really, most people discover our content through Facebook, so they discover one piece of content rather than the whole thing. They don't come in and browse. But I think these things exist in streams. They exist in people's Twitter streams and Facebook streams, and they operate separately. So there's an audience that finds the cat video incredibly compelling and amusing. There's another audience that really wants to know about Russian troop movements in the Ukraine. So I think
that's more of a that sounds like a proprietor model. That's almost like the Murdoch model that says, well, I'll run the Australian at a loss because I want to, and I'm effectively in charge of the organisation, and I'll drive that cross-subsidy. And that's exactly what Kerry Packer did with Channel 9. And one of the reasons that you've had a cutting back of the investment in news and current affairs at commercial broadcasters is that old-style commercial proprietors like Packer would say, well, I'm happy to make a lot of money, but I don't have to maximise my profit. I'll cross-subsidise because I want to invest in news and current affairs. And that sounds like it's...
I think that's right. And I think if you look back a century ago, most newspapers were run by benevolent tycoons rather than... and didn't necessarily make a lot of cash. And I think, obviously, the 20th century was rivers of gold for publishers. But I think now, we've seen Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post. Yeah. Maybe Gina Reinhardt is the saviour of Fairfax. You don't know. It depends, perhaps not.
Maybe she is.
Yeah. I'm going to bring Tim back in at this point.
I think it also comes down to the intent of the publisher. And you do have to think that a publisher exists to make money in terms of so they can keep publishing. But you do have to think, and I speak as a publisher, that there is a greater good of why you do this. So we don't exist just to publish cat videos. We exist to try and get information out there, to inform people, to entertain. And I'll give you an example of how I suppose this argument works in terms of that I think that cat videos are saving journalism. And an example, when I say cat videos, I kind of mean the lighter side of content. So I kind of mean all that kind of light stuff. An example is a Scott Ludlam piece that we posted in kind of March last year, which is a video where he said to Tony Abbott, to an empty West Australian Parliament, he said, "We want our country back." The post went viral. We got about 750,000 views just on Junkie. And from that, we made advertising dollars. So, we got some money in, and we decided as a publisher that our role then was to kind of take this story a little bit further. So we got a young journalist, we sent him to Perth, and he spent 5 days embedded with Scott Ludlam's campaign in the lead up to the West Australian Senate election. Beautiful. We published a 5,000-word piece on that, and that was an expensive exercise for us. That was, we are a small publisher, and we used the proceeds of some relatively light, cheap, easy to produce content to invest it in what we consider for our audience to be journalism.
So what do you think your ratio to cat videos to serious journalism is?
At the moment,
about 50 to 1 or what?
At the moment, it's probably, I would say the light content is maybe 70, 80%.
Animal content's single digits of BuzzFeed posts. So people use animals as a way to bash us, and obviously I think animals are incredibly important. And hopefully we'll discuss a bit more about
cat videos. What about as a percentage of audience numbers?
Oh, as a bigger percentage than that of traffic, yeah, because obviously cats are the most important thing on the internet.
Okay, well let's touch on something which Peter alluded to, which is you left Fairfax and invested personally to make a couple of sort of, I guess, journalistic experiments, one of which was PolitiFact. Talk us through that experience. And the impression I get sitting here is that you lost your money doing that.
I lost my money and some other people's money, but yeah, that's true. I didn't lose a lot of my own money. I don't want to sound like I sort of lost $1 billion. Didn't have $1 billion to lose. But so PolitiFact was the idea, it's a US idea. I brought it into this country to fact check the last federal election. And it's this idea that, there are, in essence, when politicians... the politics essentially is sound bites. Is the way we receive politics is through grabs and statements. And so, are all those statements 100% factually true? Clearly, they are not. But are they all 100% factually incorrect? No, again, they are not. So, the idea of PolitiFact is to examine the statement, the factual statement, and then give it a gradation of truth from true, mostly true, half true, mostly false, false, and then if it's complete egregious lie, pants on fire. And we established PolitiFact in March of last year, and we had a glorious 6 or so months until the money ran out, and created a massive audience. I had a content deal with Channel 7, I was on the box a bit, and I also had a content deal, funny enough, with Fairfax. And I would love to do it all again sometime. What I learnt from that, though, is that I wish I had fact-checked what cats say, because I'm sure I would have been able to drive more traffic. But no, I think that there is a market out there. It's an interesting thing. We were talking in the dressing room about crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is a revenue model. And I really thought about PolitiFact as a crowdfunded, could we do it? And the answer is, of course, we could have. But then I suspect that the people who would give to a political fact-checking site were probably tended to be on the left, and that might destroy the business model of what PolitiFact was about. And I think we have to be very mindful of the inbuilt biases of the audience. And these guys over there are particularly mindful of that. And then, of course, along came the ABC and its own fact-checking unit and kind of completely buggered me. So, thanks, pal.
Not to worry.
Yeah.
There is a serious point to that about what is the ABC for.
Yeah.
Is it a market failure organisation due to step back when commercial players are doing something?
It's never only been a market failure organisation. The Charter talks about taking account of what commercial broadcasters are doing, but we do programming of broad appeal and of specialist interest. But channels 7, 9 and 10 have never said, well, when you're shutting down that 7 o'clock news service, we're out here doing news on commercial channels. We operate side by side. We all watched what had happened in the States. We all saw the emergence of fact-checking. There are about 4 different models of fact-checking that emerged last year, and we were one of them. And I think that was a reasonable thing for us to do. And, there are some things that a public broadcaster can and should do because it's hard for people to turn a profit out of it. And, there will be this debate as to, are we distorting the market or not? But I think in a lot of these digital spaces, in fact, you put the fact-checking thing to one side. The problems that the newspapers are facing with paywalls and getting advertising online, that's not an ABC. ABC's not the cause of that. The cause of that is hundreds of millions of other websites. We're not taking $1 revenue from them. Most people don't just go to one website or another website, they go to a range of websites. And if the ABC wasn't there, I don't think it would make a skerrick of difference to the profitability of Fairfax and News Corp. But Australia would miss the ABC not being there.
Peter.
Oh, can I just jump in? You're going to get a brand. Do you want your applause?
No,
sorry,
Look, mate,
sorry, can you give Mark his applause?
No. No, you got to understand.
He needs it. You're taxpayers.
Yeah, they're owners, mate. It's like a shareholder meeting for me.
They have their money back. They want the $10 million you spent on fact-checking back.
A fraction of that.
A fraction. Okay. So all I was going to say is in terms of subscriptions, digital subscriptions actually are going up. And if you looked at the Fairfax accounts that were out a week ago, you'll see that digital revenues are actually falling. The CPMs, the dollars per click, are actually falling. And these guys would know a lot about that too. I'll chuck over to them. But then you would too, Tim, in Umbrella. That the actual CPMs are falling, and that it's actually, there is a really healthy thing happening here, is that subscriptions are going up. Look at the Oz, subscriptions now are going up 25% year on year. So paywalls.
A long time before that'd be enough to pay for the journalism, though.
Well, I think there's more people reading the Oz than ever before.
Yeah.
And a lot of those, about a third of those people are coming in, paying through the paywall, through the digital subscription. So there's a plus going on here.
The critical question, I think the unknown question though, is if you say that print days are numbered, which gets people jittery, and Murdoch says they'll be there forever, and Fairfax, I think, changes its story a bit on this. But if, in fact, it was a digital-only play, what would the revenues from advertising and subscriptions, how big a newsroom can it fund?
Sure, and I would make the point at this point, and everyone's talking down, it's been very common to talk down print, and God knows Fairfax does it, is that 90 cents in the dollar that the Oz earns comes through print. Now, at this point. Yeah. I'm not saying that the future isn't digital, but I'm saying at this point, and the trickiness in all this, in this massive debate we're having, especially in the traditional media, is what is the point? What's the inflection point? And that is the scary bit.
But is that a print strength story, or is that a digital revenues weakness story? Because when we were at the Saturday Herald together, it was selling 440,000 copies. It's selling 220,000 copies now. Yep. And I think the unknown question is, when print has its day, and the daily print newspaper has its day, how big a newsroom will a digital-only play be able to fund? Now,
Peter,
some people
I'll come
say,
back to you on that. I want to bring Simon and Tim back in at this point as well. Tim, you've launched a number of different sites. Would you ever look at a subscription model, for instance?
No, not at all. So our position has always been that the free to read, free to share, and that's because our model is based around shareable content. So if you want people to be able to share it and to kind of put it on Facebook and Twitter, it needs to be accessible to everybody.
Do you see it as a workable model in the right circumstances?
I would love if I think every different publisher is going to figure out what their business model is and whatever works for them. To answer Mark's question, I think a digital-only model of the Australian would have far less journalists that wouldn't be able to support that. But I do think also that at the moment people seem to be dealing with the move from print to online. But the move from online to mobile has happened even quicker. It's caught almost everyone unawares. Like our audience is now about 60% views it through their mobile. And the ability to make money off a mobile, if you thought from print to desktop was bad, from desktop to mobile is minimal. So that is kind of like the real discussion that happens. And that's only happened in about the past 5 years. The graph has just been like that to mobile.
Now, Simon, clearly it's not your business model, but as a journalist, do you see paywalls as?
Well, I pay for the Fairfax. I pay for News Corp. Yeah, I pay for quite a lot of publications online because that's the only way of supporting them. But at the same time, our business model, I think, shows that we have nearly 300 writers and editors, journalists around the world, and I think and we're purely driven by online, and all our content is free for readers. So I think that shows that you can build a newsroom without requiring people to pay, as long as you come up with intelligent ways of delivering advertising and creating revenue, definitely.
Well, just a reminder that in a few moments we'll be happy to take your questions, so don't head for the microphone just yet, but start thinking about what your question might be so that you can pants when the moment comes. Let's talk, and Tim, I'll come to you first on this, about who out there that we've not yet talked about is doing a good job or doing interesting things, either in Australia or globally. You think actually they could be a part of the solution?
I think digitally most of the big players have been discussed. I think BuzzFeed's doing great. I think Junkie were obviously doing well. The Huffington Post launch into Australia is going to be fascinating. Their model is based on kind of essentially a model of thirds, where it's 1/3 original content, 1/3 kind of scraped from the internet essentially, and 1/3 kind of user generated, where people kind of put opinions into it. I think their model has been hugely successful overseas. I question whether it's going to work in the size of the Australian market, given how already busy and already influential all the media is here.
I really like Vox and 538, which are both started by former New York Times journalists and do a really good job, I think, of kind of explaining news in a deeper way, and BuzzFeed did quite a bit of that explainer stuff as well. I think that there's a real thirst for people to understand in depth an issue, and I think that the way that they use data to explain those things is great. I think probably, for me, the most exciting kind of brand in digital media is Vice, and I think overnight we've seen that Vice have raised another $250 million, valuing them at $2.5 billion. So I think if you look at their fantastic, I think, 55-minute video series on Islamic State, they're like basically the only team that have actually had somebody embedded within Islamic State. There's 5 fantastic videos you can watch on YouTube for free, and they take you really deeply inside that story in a different way than you would get in anything else. And I think that the way that they're sending reporters and creating video content, that's a very exciting development. And I think it's probably a great challenge for people like the ABC and the BBC, the fact that these people are so deeply into the story. And I think it's going to be really. I think their journalists are operating in a kind of guerrilla style, without big TV crews around them, without satellite trucks. They're using the digital technology at their disposal to shoot and film things a lot of the time on iPhones. And I think it's going to be fascinating to see where Vice goes. And I think they're going to become a big player here as well. So I think it's going to be really interesting.
Mark, who do you respect? Who do you look to?
Well, I just think if you go back and look at traditional media brands transitioning, three, I suppose. I mean, interestingly, it looks like the BBC is about to overtake CNN as the biggest global news site, and I think the BBC's on an extraordinary investment continues to evolve its digital play well. I think in the traditional newspaper setting, you've got these two interesting models working out side by side. You've got the New York Times that's been really quite aggressive about its leveraged paywall, but still with a view very much that says, we are the New York Times, the world will come to us, and the world is coming to them in some degree. But again, the question will be what kind of newsrooms can those digital revenues reinforce? I think the Guardian model is the opposite of that says with that great analytics infrastructure, with that great reporting infrastructure out of London, you can create local versions of that with a relatively small investment of newsrooms in different places. I think the Australian experiments worked very well for them. The American experiment on the back of the Snowden leaks has not economically done as well, but I think it's a very interesting model. And 20 of those around the world for The Guardian, I think, is another interesting way of getting that quality investment in journalism brand with a strong local angle and providing what they talk about is credible revenues to support that in a philanthropic
They also got
model.
a big support here when they launched, didn't they, externally?
Yeah, they did. I mean, I think it was a big presence when they landed. But I think it was an example of, as you've said, these big global brands with all that investment that's made elsewhere arriving here, and it'll take a relatively small investment of localism across the top of it for it to feel like a local site, but to be quite a rich and powerful site. And that's what you're seeing. We've seen it with BuzzFeed, you're seeing it with the Daily Mail, you're seeing it with The Guardian, you'll see it with Huffington Post, and more, I suppose, will come.
Well, just before I get Peter's views on that, I'd like to invite you to head either to that microphone on this floor or that microphone up there if you'd like to come in with a question after Peter. But Peter, who's inspiring you?
Oh, look, as we first started about, this is a golden age, so I spend my days, I do follow Vox and 538 quite a lot. I think they're terrific. I follow what these guys are doing. Obviously, I follow the ABC. I think, multiple things. I do like pedestrian TV, for instance. I think that's a lot of fun. So there's this wonderful, there's a lot going on. I think the question again is this: do you know your audience? How well do you know your audience? And are you prepared to engage with that audience in multiple ways? And I think still, a newspaper like the Sydney Telegraph knows its audience. It knows it exceedingly well, and it engages with its audience exceedingly well. The Oz engages with its audience exceedingly well. Obviously, the ABC does. So it's about what I looked for examples of media, and there's so much media now that has a successful engagement strategy with its audience, respects its audience, and lets its audience in. And I think the one thing we don't do enough of in this country is open the doors, as it were, and let the audience in. Because if the digital world teaches us anything, it teaches us that, journos don't sit on Mount Journo anymore. They're down here in the valley with the rest of us. And we journos need to appreciate that and recognize that, and not see it as the threat that it may seem at first, but see it as a great, great opportunity. In a sense, for people like me, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So okay. I'm buzzed up on that.
Well, let's go to some questions. See what you did there. Yeah. We'll go to the question. We'll take a question from this floor first.
Hi.
And if you could tell us who you are as well, please.
My name's Emma. Okay, I don't want to get in the middle of your smackdown, but I think you both... it sounds like you all agree that journalism is just giving people stuff they want to read, whether it's truth or entertainment. I'm just wondering whether the thing that needs saving is advertising. Because it seems like people don't really want to read advertising. And it seems like you guys are actually trying to make them... Is that not a little bit sneaky?
Good question. Tim, you're the most commercial person on the panel.
Yes, so the whole concept of native advertising, the fourth part of the definition that I kind of didn't mention was clearly signposted. So it's not designed to be sneaky. You're not meant to kind of like read a story and you get to the bottom, it's like, haha, that was selling you soap. Like, the concept of native advertising is we pay our writers better when they're creating native advertising, so because it's funded by brand, than we do when it's a normal piece, because we can afford to. So generally the quality is a little bit higher. the audience, as long as there's kind of good quality control. So we've done about 300 pieces of native advertising in the past 18 months. Junkie's almost entire business model is based around native. And some of those are great, some are not great, but we're kind of constantly trying to make them better and better so that the audience actually wins.
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, I think you're actually saving advertising because you're making it palatable.
Yes, it is. And wouldn't you rather read a greatly constructed, beautifully designed kind of piece of content that somehow got to do with that advertiser, as opposed to just a giant banner flashing at it?
Yeah. but I think advertisers would think it's a golden era for advertisers. They had very few outlets. They were paying vast amounts of money at very, very high prices. They never knew who was watching. They never knew who was listening. Now they have all this analytics, all this data, all these different outlets. And the people who are struggling are those media outlets that really had a powerful, almost oligopolistic position with advertisers, and it's the media outlets that have lost their power over the advertisers that's led to the disintegration of the model.
That's a great question. So we've got a lot of questions, so we'll go back upstairs for the next question. Again, if you could tell us who you are, please.
I'm Sebastian. Hi. In the context of news journalism and in the shift of the selective pressures of sort of media, is everybody entitled to an opinion?
Sure you are. Is that it? I mean, I don't know. Of course. What do you mean by that, though? Just explain it a bit more, because I'm sure you're getting at something. Who you hate most? You got a hate thing going on there. Come on.
So there's a clear difference between well-researched journalism and comments on Facebook. And I'm concerned with the spread of information based on not factual elements, but sort of hearsay.
Can I just... Look, I think it's a good point, and clearly not all opinions are equal, that all opinions should be heard. Going back to this engagement question, one of the other very quiet little projects I'm involved with, which I've been involved with 2 years, and it's really not going anywhere, but it's this idea that you can have a more engaged and nuanced view of opinion. And so I've created a thing called Milk Pilot, which has 5 criteria, which ask people when they've read something, what they thought of it against enjoyment, transparency, impact, uniqueness, a few other questions. And so seeking on a sliding scale to get people to engage with that piece of content. And I think that's sort of where, in the digital world, gives us the capacity to do that. I don't think Milk Pilot's going anywhere much, but it's a great fun thing to do. But I do believe, yes, I don't think we're in the business of shutting down opinion. Absolutely not.
Well, they sound like BuzzFeed badges. That's how we brand our content. Badge our content. Our readers kind of vote things up, and they give them badges based on how they respond to them. So.
Okay, let's take another question, if you don't mind, please.
My name's Keith. Do you think there's a model in the future for a totally crowd-funded, crowd-supplied, let me say, journalistic site where the crowd is actually not just a feed for ideas, but is a coagulated source of information, and somebody manages that, and that actually takes the place of your 500 journalism. Instead, you've got 50 million journalists producing articles.
I think in some ways we're sort of almost there already, in that like what a lot of BuzzFeed does is kind of report the social web. So there's this discussion going on social media. There's people discussing things and arguing about it. There's things breaking all the time. So our reporters don't work in the same way that reporters used to, where they spend a day working on something and at the end of the day they publish the kind of definitive version. The version that we publish is often the one that's been worked on all the time. Our reporters sort of Twitter as a notebook, and they kind of reporting as they go, learning and sharing what they know. And so I think we're almost at that place already, that there's this kind of collaboration that people are undertaking on trying to get to the kind of core and the source, the truth of a story.
And Mark, you were nodding at that point, at that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the old-style journalism model was journalists in the newsroom who really didn't know what was going on, trying to find out what had actually happened out there. And so I think, as Peter said earlier, part of the coming down of the barriers is a far more collaborative exchange with our audience to more quickly tap into the expertise that's out there. And I think we've had examples already when current affairs teams used to work in absolute silence, in secrecy, when they were doing a big story, whereas now we're more inclined to say, this is a story we're doing in 4 weeks' time, and to try and draw in the expertise that exists in the audience and inside. So whether in fact that's a self-contained model as you described, I don't know, but there are far more opportunities that everyone's taking advantage of to tap the expertise that's out there.
Okay, Peter, then Tim, then we'll take another question upstairs.
Just an example you might want to look at in the fact-checking space. In Germany, in the last German federal election, there was a site called Factomat. And Factomat was used sort of basic fact-checking things, but what it did, which was really interesting, was it went out to the audience and said, hey, what are you interested in fact-checking? Got lots of suggestions came back to them, and then they essentially boiled it down by how many people voted on it. So they put them back up, here's the top 5, let's vote on it, and they picked the top 3 or something like that. So essentially that was using the crowd. It's a little bit German and cumbersome, to be honest, but nonetheless, I think that there is a way of doing that, for sure. Absolutely, I agree.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Tim, I'll bring you in.
Yeah, I think that almost exists already, and it's called Twitter, in terms of, you know, there's entire news stories that are just, here's some better tweets, and anyone can kind of, you know, give their opinion. And there's also sites, New Zulu is one where citizen journalists can kind of sell photos. They can go, you can take a photo here and you can put it up there and someone can buy it from you.
Okay, thanks for that. We'll take a question from upstairs, and thank you for that question, Keith.
Hi, my name's Michaela Callan. I think my greatest concern with developments in journalism has to do mostly with content and the quality of the printed word, I guess, whether it's on computer or not. I just wonder, to what extent do media producers have to, when they're driven by corporate interests, what motivation they have to maintain the integrity and balance in journalism? Because I notice even the more reputable old-style print media sometimes are resorting to much more simplistic representations of news, I guess because they're competing for people's attention and they're looking for shorter grabs.
Peter, I'll come to you first. That feels like there's 2 issues there, quality and integrity.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's not a joke. I wander around sometimes saying to people, trust me, I'm a journalist. And, you know, people laugh. Of course, you should laugh. But, you know, it does strike me.
Laugh as much as you thought.
Yeah, that's right.
Keep going,
no, clearly not. We're laughing on the inside. It's okay. It seems to me that that journos exist. We used to all understand. I think you have a great point, because I think we used to all understand what journos were. You know, okay, they're scumbags, but nonetheless, they had sort of a kind of a belief in the truth, go and find the truth, shine light in dark places, and they had a set of skills that enabled them to do that. You know, and there is a real danger that as we move into this idea that everyone's a journalist, that not all journalists are equal. And I think that goes down to, and I've been interested in these guys talking about this, because it goes largely, I think, still to the power of the brand. And it's about brands you trust. Obviously, it's often about brands that reflect your own view of the world, which is also true, but it's about brands you trust. So, you know, you trust the Oz to do the journalism because it employs professional journalists. I don't know if you've got any great concept about, you know, do you trust the journos on Junkie? You know, in 10 years' time, we'll probably be trusting them more than we trust the Oz. I don't know. But right now, I think there's a real interesting point. And I think what it needs to be about is that journos need to be accountable. And journalists and people who say they're journalists, whether amateurs or professionals, need to be accountable for what they do.
Mark?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is that I don't think we should assume that journalism is like the court system, that there are a whole series of standards and independent integrity that is meant to follow. It's called the media business because it's the media business. And unless you've got a proprietor who decides that they're not going to maximise profit, if you're a publicly listed company and you have shareholders and a commitment to maximise return, then they will try and maximise the financial return of the business. And one of the changes you've seen in, say, Fairfax over the last 30 years is a migration from a family proprietor model to an open shareholder model where they have to solve the journalism problem in a way that maximises the return for their shareholders. And in that, to that extent, it's not a public good. It's a media business, and whilst they're going to try and protect the brand and uphold it,
isn't it? It's the balance of the public good and the business.
But what you've seen, even though we've got the emergence of some new proprietors, by and large, the influence of the old-style media proprietors have gone. Most of the media companies that are listed, that we engage with every day, traditional media, are publicly listed companies, and they have a responsibility to maximise their profit, and they make choices accordingly.
Well, let's ask that firstly of Tim. Tell me about a time when an advertiser has tested your integrity.
I don't know if I can. But the reality, I think, of just to answer her question, is that as long as the journalists have the right intention, and the intention of, as what Peter says, the noble things of the search for truth and all those lovely things that journalists aspire to, I think the reality is that there are less resources today. There is less fact-checking. There is less subbing. In fact, there's a great term that was coined by a BBC journalist in 2008 called churnalism, which is the rise of journalism as kind of like churning out press releases and just taking things off the newswire. And that is, I think, a fact of the modern newsroom. It is a fact of decreasing revenues. And I think that as long as the intention is there, then from the journalist, I think we kind of have to take a little bit of that with a grain of salt.
Simon, and
then
I'll
really,
take a question.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about, like our proprietor, Jonah Peretti, basically, he talks about this idea of the Paris Café, which is this idea that like you might be there in your Paris Café reading Jean-Paul Sartre and the Le Monde and being very serious, and then all of a sudden somebody comes beside you with a really cute dog, and you kind of pat the dog and you feel like really warm and emotional about that dog. It doesn't mean that, when you go back to the Le Monde or the philosophy that they're any less important. It just means that these things can coexist. They're not, they don't need to be independent. And I feel like with BuzzFeed, we have a whole load of entertaining and amusing content, but also we have serious stuff as well. And I think the two can actually coexist, and I think we can find business models where the two can coexist.
Okay, thank you. Let's take another question from the floor, please.
Sorry. Hi, my name's Juliette. You've spoken about the fact that there is a great business model for journalism and it's moving forward, but there's a lot of journalists that are out of work, obviously. Mark, you've had to let go of quite a lot, and there's a lot in print as well. I've recently lost my job as well. What's your tips for journalists? Do we have to retrain, or do we have to learn how to make cat videos?
Peter, you lost your job at Fairfax. You're a good place to start.
One of the, riffing off this title of this talk is, I think journalists need to save themselves. And I know that's really easy to say and not so hard, not so easy to do. But, so I sort of left Fairfax in 2012, and I look back on that period now, 80 months or so, as a great period of reinvention where I went and learnt new skills. I think, we need to become good at, not necessarily cat videos, but maybe video and data, analytics. We need to work out how we tell stories. I mean, one thing that these guys show, and actually the ABC to a large extent too, is that there are multiple ways of telling stories. Yesterday afternoon, in fact, when I was doing the prep for this, I went on Storyfy and I did my first Storyfy, which just sounds like I'm 50 years out of date. But it was a really exciting thing to do. And, if you haven't done it, go and do it. There's multiple ways. There's ways to do it. So I think that's point one. How are you going to get paid? I think you should start your own website and find your own spot. And then if that fails, hassle the shit out of these guys because they're going to give you a job.
We have 2 jobs open at the moment.
There you go.
It's worked already.
I'll take 10%.
Well, actually, that's a good point, Tim. And what skills do you look for?
Yeah,
when
so
you
we're
advertise
actually
those
for a
jobs?
travel editor at the moment and a electronic music writer. So if you're a travel editor, speak to me afterwards. But another interesting space, and this is not for every journalist, is that almost every brief that comes through to us from our media agency, MCN, involves content. And a lot of brands are now starting to hire ex-journalists to create content editors. Tourism Australia recently hired an editor. ANZ launched a publication called ANZ Blue Notes, which is staffed essentially by ex-AFR journalists. So there's kind of like a bit of a shift in space. It might not be for every journalist, but if you are willing to work with a brand, I think there's lots of different opportunities out there.
Sorry. I was working for a brand, so I'm wanting to get back onto that other side. So
he's your man.
Yeah.
Speak to me afterwards.
Yeah, and look, same question to Simon as well. What actual journalistic skills do you look for?
I think for a company like ours, people really need to be digital natives, and I think I'm echoing Peter, but they really need to understand the motivations for why people share content as well. I think the thing is, people traditionally used to go to the newspaper and buy the newsagent and buy a newspaper, and now most people from us are finding content through Facebook or through other social medias. And I think it's a sense of understanding, personally yourself, what makes a piece of content shareable, why people would want to do it. So you have to really drill down into, what can you discover, what skill set can you develop that will actually sort of reach a bigger audience?
Mark, what journalist recruits for the ABC? What do they look like?
Well, I mean, one of the things we found when we created News 24, and we did a lot of recruitment, was that your young journalists were arriving with a far more complete battery of skills than we traditionally had, and the ability to tell the complete story in their own right, you know, to film, to edit it, to package it and deliver it all up together. So I think we're seeing more of that, far more of that too, and the ability to operate very comfortably across platform. You really need to be able to deliver that story on the appropriate platform to be able to engage whatever audience you can find, and all our journalists are doing that now.
And some more cats.
Yeah.
It's interesting, actually, the most shared story on ABC Facebook is actually a story about little penguins needing jumpers, more than any piece of news content. That's the thing.
We know that.
So like even the ABC...
It's a broad church. I mean, here's the audience, and they all clicked on.
Now, I'm conscious we have probably already more questions than we have time for, so let's try and go fast. We'll go back upstairs for this question, please.
My question's, my name's Stephanie, sorry. I've got a lot of young people in my life, 15 to 25. When I grew up, we were talking about what was on the news. I remember always having a newspaper in the house. We stopped buying The Australian about 5 years ago because my husband and I were the only ones actually reading it. And our dinner table conversation now is, what are the latest cat videos? Who's seen what and what's this? And I showed my kids a sausage dog in a puppy in a roll the other day. They all goofed about, all thought it was great. But sadly, they'd seen it 5 years ago. And so I wasn't very cool at all. So I get that your business models, commentary, journalism used to sell products, feeds the desire for our young to live and be entertained. But my kids actually don't actually get the difference between Iraq, Syria, or the Ukraine at the moment, except for the fact that they're really glad they don't fly Malaysian Airlines. So how do we go from this model that our youth are consumed by to actually getting them to be more globally aware and engaged, not for self-gain, but to actually become responsible citizens that are aware of the world and going to be our next leaders?
Okay, that's a good question. I think it's actually going to be, by the looks of time, I think that will probably be our final question as well, so I'll ask our panel to kind of wrap up as they go through. And Mark, I'm going to start with you. You're a former educationalist as well, so maybe kind of look to the future a little bit.
Look, I think as we've engaged on it, we think young people are interested in news. It's just got to be packaged in a way that they find engaging and compelling. And I suppose the BuzzFeed model is if you can put it in an environment that attracts people in and package it well, they'll find it. We get a phenomenal response to things like BTN, Behind the News we run, just enormous feedback. And I think the American experience of Jon Stewart and Colbert packaging news in an entertainment guise has proved to be quite successful. So I think I think you can make a case that young people have never been more internationally minded, never been more globally minded. But the challenge for traditional media outlets like us is how you find and create and package news in a way that A, they will find it, and B, they'll find it compelling when they do find it.
Peter, you optimistic?
I am optimistic. I have 2 young children. We force them to watch the news. That probably doesn't work as well with 15-year-olds, I guess. Look, I think it's a big challenge. There's no argument about that. I do think that if you think back at your own sort of life in terms of how you use the media, I mean, when I was 15, I probably, I maybe read a newspaper once a week, maybe. I think it does change in different stages of your life. I do think there's a lot of upside in Facebook and Twitter and such like. Not so much Twitter, but Facebook, for people receiving news in sort of kind of almost it seeps in. So they do know what's going on in Syria. I mean, that's great, isn't it? They do know it's probably not cool to go on Malaysia Airlines. My final point is...
we'll have to cut you off there, Peter, otherwise the other two...
Okay, can I just make one final point? Is that I think we've reached peak cat. I think we've reached the peak cat moment because Simon ran a story last week saying the 100 best cat videos of all time, so we've reached peak cat, so thanks for coming.
Simon, the future, have we reached peak cat?
No, I don't think we have reached peak cat, or peak dog, or peak quokka, or sloth, or anything. There's lots of animals on the internet. I think the thing is, one of the things that really excites me is that, like on BuzzFeed, we are trying to do the serious stuff, but also we're trying to package the serious stuff in a way sometimes that is accessible to young people. So it's like the most surreal sites for the Syrian civil war or something. That's actually like a way that somebody would actually get into something that they would never have got into before. And I think it's actually incumbent on us. That's where our sense of responsibility comes, to be engaging with this really young audience. The ABC's average age, I think, is 60-something, is it? Our audience is very young, so it's really incumbent on new publishers to sort of really be engaging with our audience.
And Tim, finally.
And I agree. I think the hierarchy of news has completely been lost, mainly thanks to Facebook. And our research shows us that almost 3/4 of young people are getting more of their news from social media, from newspapers or TV. So I think the responsibility lies on us, new media publishers. Our aim is to de-stupidify the internet. So encourage your kids to follow BuzzFeed, follow Junkie.
And I have been into the BBC a couple of times in the last month to actually speak to their news producers and help them out a little bit. So
it's a good ambition to have. Thank you so much for so many good questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all. Please thank Tim, Simon, Mark and Peter.